Tensions around a possible ceasefire in Ukraine continue to unfold as the Kremlin says it needs a full briefing from the United States before making any commitments. On Wednesday, March 12th, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov stated that Moscow expects details on the U.S.-Ukrainian talks held in Saudi Arabia before commenting on whether the proposed 30-day ceasefire is acceptable to Russia. Surely you'll have a question about the results of yesterday's American-Ukrainian talks in Jeddah and all the statements made and joint statements adopted. I can tell you that we are carefully studying the statements made as a result and are familiarizing ourselves with the text of the joint statement adopted in Jeddah. We assume that, as was said yesterday in Jeddah, Secretary of State Rubio and National Security Advisor Walt will inform us through various channels in coming days about the details of the negotiations that took place and the understandings reached. His remarks come after Ukraine signaled its support for the American proposal, with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio confirming that Washington would now take the offer to Moscow. Peskov emphasized that the Kremlin is awaiting direct communication from Rubio and White House National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, expected in the coming days. He also did not rule out a potential phone call between Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump, stating that such a conversation could be arranged very quickly if needed. That we also do not rule out that the topic of a telephone conversation at the highest level may arise, but if such a need arises, it will be organized very quickly. The existing channels for dialogue with the Americans allow this to be done in a fairly short time. Speaking from Ireland after the U.S.-Ukraine discussions in Saudi Arabia, Secretary Rubio made it clear that Washington is awaiting Russia's response.
Now we all eagerly await the Russian response and urge them strongly to consider ending all hostilities so people will stop dying, so bullets will stop flying, and so a process can begin to find a permanent peace. I think the first step in all this is the acceptance that there is no military solution to this conflict. Neither side can militarily achieve their maximalist gains, their maximalist goals. Neither side can achieve them through the military side. The only way this conflict can end is through negotiation. That's the only way you're going to have peace, is through negotiation. And so we need to start that process. And it is hard to start a process when people are shooting at each other and people are dying. And so our hope is that we can stop that, all these hostilities, and get to a negotiating table where both sides, over some period of time with a lot of hard work, can find a mutually acceptable outcome that, in the case of Ukraine, obviously secures their long-term prosperity and security.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has framed the ceasefire as an opportunity not just to pause the fighting, but to push for a broader peace deal. Speaking at a press conference on March 12th in Jeddah, Zelensky urged the world to recognize Ukraine's desire to end the war. I am very serious about a ceasefire, and for me, it is important to end the war. I want the President of the United States to see it. I want Americans to see and feel it. I want Europe and all to be in alliance in order to do everything to force Russia to end this war. We are ready for a ceasefire for 30 days as proposed by the American side. As for the security guarantees, we will talk about them in more details, but if there is a ceasefire for 30 days. These 30 days are given to prepare a draft. We have our proposals, but we will draft the steps that we will agree on with our allies and formats of security guarantees, which Ukraine will have after the war is over. Beyond the ceasefire, Zelensky confirmed Ukraine's readiness to sign a framework deal with the U.S. on rare earth minerals as a first step. We have always talked about it honestly. I thought we would sign it earlier. There is nothing to talk about. There are no secrets behind the scenes. We are ready, he said. Meanwhile, Marco Rubio said that the U.S.-Ukraine mineral deal will benefit both the countries.
Well, I think that a minerals deal is something that I think is beneficial for both countries. Certainly one of the things that provides for Ukraine's long-term prosperity and security is vibrant economic growth and development. Their GDP begins to grow, and that gives them a tremendous amount of leverage and power and the ability to fund their own defenses. So I think certainly any economic development for Ukraine is positive for their own future. Obviously, if the United States has a vested economic interest somewhere, we're tied to them on an economic front, we're in partnership with them on something, we will have an interest in the future of Ukraine as well. I wouldn't couch it as a security guarantee, but certainly if the United States has a vested economic interest that's generating revenue for our people as well as for the people of Ukraine, we'd have a vested interest in protecting it if it were to be challenged or threatened.
Back in Washington, the U.S. announced the resumption of military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine, signaling a renewed commitment to Kiev's defense. Zelensky also hinted that the meeting in Jeddah helped de-escalate recent tensions between him and U.S. President Donald Trump, following a public disagreement last month. One may see different results achieved in Saudi Arabia. One saw restoration of aid as the main result. Another saw the first step towards the end of the war as the main result. I believe that the meeting itself in Saudi Arabia ruins Russian plans to escalate relations between Ukraine and the United States. On the contrary, there is de-escalation escalates. The battle for the Kursk region appears to be shifting rapidly. Reports on Wednesday indicate that Ukrainian forces holding a salient inside Russia's Kursk Oblast have been forced to retreat. While official Ukrainian sources have yet to confirm a full withdrawal, multiple observers, including open-source intelligence group Deep State, suggest Kiev's troops have now left the key town of Susa, but remain in parts of the region. We are also closely following all the information that comes from our military. The data that our military personnel are giving us indicates that our troops are successfully advancing in the Kursk region, liberating those areas that were under the control of the militants. The dynamics are good. Independent ONT analysts say Russian forces entered today with little resistance. Russian pro-war channels have published footage of Russian soldiers raising their flags alongside banners of the Russian Empire, the airborne forces, and even the Wagner Group on Soviet skier square for Ukraine. The Kursk incursion was always a strategic maneuver. Since launching an offensive in August, Kiev's forces had seized over 1,300 square kilometers inside Russia, aiming to use the territory as leverage in future negotiations. Now the control has dwindled to less than 200 square kilometers, according to Deep State. Less than 24 hours after negotiations in Saudi Arabia, which saw Ukraine agree to a 30-day truce brokered by the U.S.-Russian missiles and drones tore through Ukrainian cities, leaving devastation in their wake. One of the deadliest attacks took place in Odessa, where a Russian ballistic missile struck the city's sea trade port, killing 4 crew members aboard the Japanese vessel, a foreign ship loading weight for export. Preliminary reports say 3 of the victims were Syrian nationals, while the 4th was Ukrainian. Another crew member and a pilot service worker were injured in the blast. Meanwhile, in Dnipro, Russian forces targeted critical infrastructure, damaging homes and shattering windows in a school and kindergarten. Air defenses managed to intercept 12 out of 20 incoming drones, but the strikes still left destruction behind. Earlier in the day, a missile hit an infrastructure site in Kryvyi Rih, killing a 47-year-old woman and injuring 2 others. In Kiev overnight, drone attacks triggered fires after debris fell on a residential house and a furniture store. Fortunately, no casualties were reported. But in Donetsk, local prosecutors confirmed 3 deaths and 2 injuries following Russian strikes. These attacks come just as Ukraine publicly embraced the U.S.-led ceasefire initiative. The deal reached in talks with American officials in Saudi Arabia calls for a 30-day halt in fighting. But with missile strikes continuing even after the agreement, the question remains, will Moscow even consider pausing its offensive in